Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this JOFA webinar entitled JOFA in the United Kingdom, a case study in going from 0 to 60. I'm very happy that you have joined us. My name is Pam Greenwood, and I will be moderating tonight's session. But let me just say before we begin that I truly hope tonight's session is a conversation and that much of our discussion will involve questions from the audience. I live in West Orange, New Jersey, with my husband and 4 children who range in age from 9 to 17. And I serve on the JOFA board and have responsibility for 3 main domains of concern. I coordinate JOFA's Torah lending program. I am currently reorganizing our network of women's tefillah initiatives, and I am involved in helping emergent communities in the U.S. get started with JOFA activities. And I guess it's in that last capacity that I am moderating this session today, as Dina is going to offer us some really helpful advice on her model of success. So who is our speaker today? Dina Brower lives in Boreham Wood, which is a neighborhood in London, with her husband, Rabbi Naftali Brower, and her 4 children, who range in age from, let me see if I get this right, 10 to 21. Okay. Gina has served for the past 2 years as JOFA's UK ambassador. And as of September, Dina is super busy because she also began her studies, most of which she's doing remotely at Yeshivat Maharat. I am not going to tell you too much about Dina's life before she became JOFA's UK ambassador, because hopefully we're going to hear about what prompted her to want to take on this role as she's talking. So welcome, Dina, and welcome all of you. Let's begin, Dina, just by telling us how you launched JOFA in the UK in 2013, and a little bit to understand what you've done and what JOFA UK's mission is.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to everyone. So in 2013, we launched by actually holding an open meeting. So we invited anybody who was interested in Orthodox feminism to come out on one very, very cold, actually probably the coldest night ever in London. And about 70 people turned up to this meeting, men and women. And I set the agenda by talking about what JOFA stood for, what its mission statement is, what it has achieved in the United States since its inception, and invited people to work in open space. That is a model where people can just decide what's the burning issue for them. They will write up the topic on a piece of, on a poster, hang it on the wall, and anybody else who wants to join them in that conversation can join them. And what was really interesting was that, we ended up with 8 groups, ranging from, education for women, gender roles in schools, Torah education for girls in girls' schools specifically, a Guna issue, having a more modern Orthodox rabbinate, and then one of the topics was about women's tefillah and partnership minyanim. Ended up becoming a conversation, but what was really very telling was that half of the room ended up, people in open space, people can start in one conversation, then kind of float from one conversation to the other, and by, midway through the meeting, half of the room was, gathered around the poster that said women's tefillah, and we're discussing that. So there was a lot of really interesting debate, and people really felt very passionate. And it created a platform so that people who had issues, who wanted change in certain areas, found a home to bring those conversations and found like-minded people to have these conversations with. So that was our launch.
Okay, that's great. So how did you get people together for this launch? How did you find the people to come to it? How did you get the PR out there?
It's amazing. I mean, what you can do with social media, really, and word of mouth. So just Facebook and a few emails here and there, and people just passed it on to their friends. And that's how people gathered. So I didn't handpick people in a sense. It wasn't a select group of usual suspects that got together to do this. The truth is that, in the UK, there have been Orthodox feminists who have, done a lot of work for many years, independently on their own, establishing a women's Megillah reading. So there's a number of them, and there have been two different women's tefillah group, one in Stanmore and in London and one in Manchester. So there has been, a lot of women's education going on, women's leadership programs. There has been, gradual progress. But I think this was the first time somebody created a platform specifically to talk about Orthodox feminism and labeled it as such, which was quite a bold move, I think. People were always afraid of the word feminism a little bit. Orthodox feminism seems like incompatible in language. And so I think it was a little different, yes, and it brought a lot of interesting people out.
Okay. Did you have a team of people who worked with you on it, or was it really mostly your initiative to get this together?
So this was really my initiative. I spoke to a few people who were sort of, the seasoned Orthodox feminists in the community who had been doing a lot of work. Some of them were really keen, some were quite hesitant. They said, this might just destroy all the years of work we've done, and maybe it's not such a good idea, and, just maybe go a little bit softer and quieter, and no need to make a big splash. But that's not what I do, so I just, came out. So no, it was something that I felt really inspired and passionate about. It started a bit earlier. My involvement with JOFA started in 2003, very slowly. I also have to admit that I'm a 10-year-old Orthodox feminist, so I did not grow up with Orthodox feminism. I'm pretty new to it. And I was first exposed to Orthodox feminism in 2003 when my husband and I spent a sabbatical year in Jerusalem. It wasn't a year, 3 months in Jerusalem. And I went to the Kolech conference. It was a 2-day conference, and it opened my eyes to a lot of different, topics that I just never had encountered.
I just want to interject for women who don't know what Kolech is, that Kolech is really JOFA's equivalent in Israel. It is the Organization for Jewish Feminism in Jewish Orthodox feminism in Israel. So I'm sorry.
That's right. Yeah, thanks for the translation. and so and then later that year, it was actually November, and I was visiting my sister who lives in New York, and I just bumped into one of her friends, and I was just telling to her about this movie called Tehorah that was showing, I had seen at Kolech, and was showing here, and we just got a conversation, and she said, "Oh, you just have to meet my mother-in-law. You guys are two peas in a pod." Turned out that her mother-in-law was Belda Lindenbaum, and so that's how I was introduced to JOFA, and Belda and I became good friends, and Belda really became my mentor, and so that's how my path in Orthodox feminism began. So I came to JOFA conferences, and was always listening and reading and just educating myself more, and became more aware of different issues. And then in 2011, JOFA held its first celebration dinner. I don't know if you remember that, but it was very moving and really, really inspiring. And when I came back, I realized that I had to bring some of that work to the UK. And it just happened to be where all things, work at the same time, that a couple of days after coming back from the JOFA dinner, I was speaking at a women's Rosh Chodesh group in London, and there were a number of women who told me how they felt that there was just no space for them in Orthodox Judaism, but they still felt very committed to belonging to the United Synagogue, which is the umbrella organization for, Orthodoxy in the UK. And they felt, some of them admitted to having joined a Reform synagogue so that they could go on occasions to get some spirituality. And I realized that there was really, a need to create a space to address some of these issues. Now, not all Orthodox feminist issues have to do with the synagogue, but for many people, the synagogue is their first window into Judaism, especially in the UK, where a lot of people belong to Orthodox synagogues, but are not necessarily, practicing an Orthodox lifestyle. And so their Judaism is very much synagogue-based rather than home-based. And so when you come to the synagogue for your Judaism and you feel you're sort of marginalized, or you feel like a spectator, that can be off-putting for some people. And we have to make sure that if this is people's first encounter with Judaism, that it's very welcoming, and that women feel engaged and needed, and there is a space for them. So
So I
Yeah,
want
so
to
that
take
was
you
just one
back
of
to that period between 2003, I think you said, and 2011. So before you launched JOFA UK, or before you knew that you had the impetus that you had to make this happen, you were a synagogue in Borum Wood, right? Your husband's the rabbi there, and you're part of that congregation. Was there anything happening there to move your new ideals for Orthodox feminism along in the synagogue community?
So actually, I moved with my husband to Bournemouth in 2007. Before that, we were in another community,
Okay.
also in London. Um, so I guess there were small things happening. There were definitely women who were interested in sort of creating spaces to have women's Megillah readings and women's akafot. Interestingly enough, you encounter a sort of like strange phenomena where women want involvement, but sometimes are also afraid and pull away when certain things are offered. Um, Especially if you're told your whole life that you cannot touch a Sefer Torah. When the Sefer Torah is brought to you, on Simchas Torah, you're afraid. And a lot of women don't want to kiss it or touch it or are afraid to kind of get too close. A lot of it is lack of knowledge. And sometimes you try to kind of engage people and you say, would you like to get involved with something like this? And they think it's completely, not for them, crazy, or not even allowed. Even if it's the rabbi telling them that, they feel still it's not allowed. So it's a delicate balance trying to kind of bring people in, and tradition sometimes overrides, and people want to hang on to a sense of tradition, and what's halachically permissible might feel untraditional. It's this two opposite poles that pull in a sense. So there wasn't a huge amount of things happening in my particular synagogue, small things, but throughout London, I would say that in the last 4 to 5 years, Megillah readings have really mushroomed. So there are more and more women's Megillah readings, and a lot of them that were in homes because they were not permitted in synagogues have been moved into the synagogues in the last 2 or 3 years. So last year, I think alone, there were 13 women's Megillah readings in London, which is quite amazing. Yeah. So it's definitely demonstrating that women have a thirst for greater involvement and participation. Perhaps not all women, but definitely a lot of women, and a lot of younger bat mitzvah girls, want to do things that are meaningful. Last Shavuot, I took part in a bat mitzvah where the girl read Megillat Ruth, and it was beautiful.
So geographically, are most of these things happening in London, or what's happening in Manchester and some of the other Jewish communities outside of London?
So it's interesting because Manchester has the only other women's tefillah group, and they seem to be quite strong and going pretty well, and they've been going for about 20 years altogether, and have done lots of very creative things. But it always feels, when I visited Manchester and Leeds, I said, oh, we're out here, nothing's happening here. But I don't know if it's, necessarily true. Everybody looks on the other side and thinks there's more going on in one place than the other. I don't know that there are women's Megillah readings all over the place. I don't know if Manchester had a women's Megillah reading. I know Oxford has one, populated by a lot of the students. And, these things are mushrooming. So I think they just, the more people do it, the more they become the norm, and the more people think it's quite normal and, join the trend in a sense.
Okay. So I don't want to forget to ask you this question, so I'm afraid that if I flip my page, I will. But you had mentioned open spaces at your first gathering, and this is important for me as someone who likes to talk about how to organize a nascent, young Orthodox feminist community. And I kind of want to understand how this open spaces program that you ran, how it went, and whether there was anyone in a leadership role kind of pushing the conversation along about women's tefillah, the fact that it garnered so many, so much attendance, so many people coming over to it. I'm just kind of curious how the program actually worked from a practical standpoint, so that those of us who want to be able to mimic something similar would know how it functioned.
Yeah. So it's something called open space technology. I didn't come up with the idea. Somebody
Okay.
suggested it to me, introduced me to the model, and I think people do it over like 3-day conferences where they want to generate interesting work. And very often, when you choose a group, you feel like you're missing out because the other group is much more interesting. And so there's a freedom of moving from one group to another and bringing your ideas. And also, it acts as a model for cross-pollinating all the conversations because you might have heard something that was going on in one particular group that could be relevant to another group, and you can just take that over to that group. And no, there wasn't any specific appointed leadership, except for the people who volunteered in the first instance to, name their topic, and the other people who joined them. It looked like there were, by the end of the evening, a couple of leaders had emerged because 2 women, decided who I know both, and they live in geographically very disparate communities and probably wouldn't have met, if not for that meeting. They both were very passionate about trying to set up a partnership minyan. And so they picked the first Sunday that was a Rosh Chodesh for the first partnership minyan. It just happened to be that that was the Sunday I had picked for the first JOFA conference. So at that open meeting, I had announced the JOFA conference. And that was our next big sort of event. The idea was for the conference to create a language and a conversation about Orthodox feminism because it was something really new. And so we invited Rabbi Dr. Daniel Sperber to talk about how halakha develops, how it changes and remains the same, how it responds and interacts with, a changing world. We had Professor Tamar Ross talk about the history of Orthodox feminism, what it has achieved in Israel with women's learning and the rest of the world, so how it has expanded the palace of Torah. And we also had Ilana Stockman, Dr. Ilana Stockman, who was then the JOFA chief executive, come and speak. And so that was really an interesting and engaging conversation. We attracted over 200 men and women. And we also had a lot of local representation, so to speak. We also had Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris, who is just about to publish a book on modern Orthodoxy and is a rabbi in London. And we also had a number of other people who spoke about, things that happen within our community and the different perspectives. And it was really very empowering and exciting. And from that, a lot of people just started talking about the issues. So we raised lots of issues. And people then fed back to me that had not been at the conference, that they had heard the conversation shift at the Shabbos table and the school gates, and people were all of a sudden talking about gender in schools and how boys and girls are taught. It just raised the issues that people needed to think about.
Have you had a conference since then in JOFA? What are the plans
So
to get put together again?
Yeah, we've had 2 big conferences. So the first one was in 2013,
Mm-hmm.
and then this last summer in 2014 we had a second conference. We were very lucky that Rabbi Dr. Yitz Grimberg and Blue Grimberg came to be our guests and spoke. And what was really exciting at this conference, we attracted a lot of university students and a lot of young teens, and we were able to actually arrange for the teens to meet Yitz and Blue on their own over lunchtime and have a conversation with them. In fact, one of those teenage girls has been so inspired. She is considering becoming our first JOFA campus fellow. So that's another exciting development for us. Yes, so in a sense, and a lot more men came to the second JOFA conference. So we had this progression. We had, a different topic. We specifically focused on the voice of women and how women can bring their voices to their communities. So how women can make their voices heard in a synagogue, but also in their own homes and the other religious spaces, so Batei Midrash and educational institutions, and in leadership of the community in general. And we published a booklet called 36 Ways to Let Your Voice Heard, giving people really practical tips of things they can do to ensure that there is a space and women's voices are heard.
Great, Erin. I hope you'll put up the link for that one. Actually, in the bottom right corner of your screen, under the chat bar, you can see that we're posting various links to videos. And there is 36 ways to let your voice be heard. Great. And just a reminder right now that we want this conversation to include you. So if you have any questions, please make sure to type them in, and we'll be sure to share them with Dina. So Dina, you mentioned the Greenbergs coming over for the conference, and Alana Stockman and a few other people from the States. Who are your leaders from within the UK? Your educators and your communal leaders who have been helping you in the drive to push JOFA UK forward?
So there have been lots of leaders, but I think the model has been very much to create a grassroots movement and empower people. So at first people asked, oh, so which rabbis are supporting this? And which Rebbitzins are going to be coming to this conference? And I said, well, the conference is open to everyone, and there's no special reserved seat or special invitation for anyone. It's very much a horizontal movement. So the idea is to really empower people to open up education, open up the discussion with the average Jew in the pew, in a sense, so that people can really, think about the issues and take them back to their own communities and discuss them with their leadership. So I don't see our role to lobby institutions or people who are in positions of leadership or authority and ask them, to do this or that, because I think each community has its own flavor. But I think opening up the discussion and also giving people the power of knowledge. One of the interesting features of the UK is that you have, as I said, a large amount of people who belong to the United Synagogue, which is Orthodox, but may have had a very limited Jewish education. Jewish schools in the UK are flourishing, but it's a recent thing. And so it's really important for people to be able to access direct sources. And, for example, the JOFA Tashma booklets are really useful because there's a lot of unclarity about what women can or cannot do. But once they can have access, to the sources in English, educate themselves, they can ask different questions of their leaders and rabbis. They can, have a different conversation because it comes from a position of knowledge. And so we're creating grassroots leaders, really, in a sense, empowering people to just, take things back to their own community.
Okay, so on the heels of that, we have a question from the audience, which is, Dina, you seem like a superwoman. Do you have any advice for women and men who want to impact their communities but are not prepared to organize a major conference, such as you've done?
Okay. So I don't think you need to necessarily organize a major conference. I think you need to provide the space for a conversation. That's what I did to begin with. And then other people came forward and helped out with the conference. And people can, help by coming. But providing the space for a conversation is really easy to do. It doesn't take much. You really, my husband and I decided to sponsor the coffee and tea and biscuits for the meeting. I was really lucky that the space where I work has a really big sort of like room that they were happy for me to use as they thought there was a good cause. And so they didn't charge me for that. And people turned up. But I think the word of mouth and the power of sort of like, grassroots organizing and social media is really something anybody can tap into. I didn't have any particular skills in that. And I just think it was just an issue of timing. So it's not about, necessarily me being a superwoman, but I think it was a timing thing. All of a sudden there was something in the air, and it was just the right moment. In fact, one of my friends, Rabbi Harris, said, I think it's an et ratzon, he said. I think it's just all of a sudden something in the air. There's just a lot in the press and the media, both Jewish and non-Jewish, about feminism. And I think it was just a topic that was ready to be discussed all of a sudden and be put on the agenda. And so people came out to talk about it, and people just continued the conversations. And then all of a sudden you have lots of parents really thinking more critically, for example, about, the roles that are assigned to girls and boys in the school plays, or how, the girls and boys are taught in schools, and what the messaging is, and lots of little things that they're thinking about that they weren't thinking about before, because the conversation began and it is a ripple effect. And so that's really, something that is important. And also, lots of other people, I think, have laid the groundwork. It's important to recognize that. And lots of people inspired me as well and supported me. So it's not something I've done, entirely on my own.
Okay.
I hope that answered it.
No, yeah, of course. So let's talk tachlis for a minute. And I really want to know what some of your initial programs were, and why you decided that those needed to be your first programs. So let's talk about the first year.
Okay, so the first year, wow, it feels like a long time ago now. But so I gotta say one thing, that when I first, planned this, I thought that it would be something that would be of very limited interest, and I never imagined that, within a few months there would be a partnership minyan. That was, partnership minyan seemed to me like the most radical thing anybody, would want to sort of put together, and I thought that the community, being as conservative as it is, would not be ready for that for another decade at least. So I think that also shows you that when you open up the space for a conversation, you might be really surprised by what comes out of it if you allow people to set the agenda rather than, decide for everybody, okay, this is what we have to do because I know, what the first step should be. I didn't really know. I could have picked my guess of the safe things to do.
So in your open space, you had actually just noted tefillah as your open space without
I didn't
qualifying it in any way.
I did not set a list of topics. I just invited people to come up and say, if there's something, if you had, okay, so this is the line. If you had a magic wand and you could change something, you have only one wish, what would it be? Okay. So think of that, and then come up, announce it to the room, write it up on a poster, and then anybody who wants to join you will join in that conversation.
Okay.
And that's really, I think, very effective way of getting the zeitgeist of what really people feel passionate about.
Okay. So I interrupted you. Back to the first year.
No, that's fine. So in the first year, we had, what we've done is, all of this has started without any sort of particular budget, and so we took advantage of opportunities. And so, for example, Rabbi Dr. Eli Holzer was visiting London because he had a friend's wedding, and he's one of the founders of Shura Chadasha. So we hosted him, and he spoke about, for example, whether feminism is a Jewish value or not. The title of the talk was Admitted or Invited. Are we allowing women into the space, but they really don't belong there, or is it something that is lechatchila we're actively doing? Are we inviting women to the space? And again, it was a really fascinating conversation. He talked a little bit about the history of Shura Chadasha, but the talk wasn't specifically about, partnership minyan is the solution to everything. He talked about the pluses and minuses of, partnership minyan and how that came about. But he also talked very passionately about how, feminism is really an important Jewish value and why he sees it as such. So that was another interesting conversation that we had. We had educational events. We had Gila Fine, who is a publisher at, she's the editor, at Magid and Koren Books, and she taught a fantastic class on a Talmudic story, and again with a feminist perspective. So we tried to do things that are not replicating what other organizations are already doing. We also got together, this was really important, all the women who lead Megillah readings, women's only Megillah readings, and provided them with a guide to how to do it, but also a space for them to talk about the pluses and minuses and things that go well, and issues that they had to deal with. And so we facilitated a conversation, because mostly what happens is that people do things independently, but there isn't a platform for them to come together. So already I had noticed that, and I had tried to introduce, for example, there was a group of women who wanted to start a Megillah reading. They had spoken to their rabbi. He was supportive, but he thought that it was November and Purim was in March, and maybe they didn't have enough time, maybe they need to wait till the next year. And I said, you know what, try it. Why don't I put you in touch with another group who's done it already? Match notes, don't reinvent the wheel, and then you can go from there. And they actually did it, and it was really successful. And that's when it occurred to me that you just needed to be able to bring people together to share their expertise. And that worked very well. So we did that. It was like a whole morning with different workshops on Megillah. We had somebody teaching the notes as a taster for those who were thinking about it, but had no idea what Megillah notes are like. We had a sofer during all the Megillot and show people a Megillah close-up, and it was a really, very enriching day. So we've done lots of events around different festivals like this, mostly hosted in people's homes, taking advantage of, scholars who are, passing through our community, and so tapping into that talent. And it's been really useful. So that has put sort of like JOFA on the map in a sense, and now people feel that there is a space and an entity where they can come together for these type of conversations. And we're now trying to take JOFA to the next sort of phase.
Okay, so people no longer just attend a JOFA event, but are they starting to be to identify themselves as being part of a JOFA community or being part of JOFA as an organization in the UK? Has that step been taken yet? Or
well, I haven't really interviewed people, but I think people already see it as much more established. And so for me, it's more than setting up an organization, is about setting up a movement. And I think in that sense, that's been very successful. Sometimes I get inquiries and people think like that there is really like a building with staff and all of that, which is great, but sometimes scary. The truth is, because JOFA is an entity here, and because there's a fantastic website with a lot of resources, it does give that impression of being very established. And the truth is, the boundaries are so fluid. You don't have to have a physical building, anywhere in a sense, because there's a lot of soft information and presence, through the internet that people can access. So that's really useful. So I think there is a bit of a sense of a community that, if you want to talk about issues, there is a space and there are other people that you can connect to who are in the same, who share the same interest. And again, I think Orthodox feminism means different things to different people, and not everybody wants to, identify with all the different issues. For some people, Orthodox feminism is all about agunot. For some people, it is about prayer and synagogue ritual, and for others, it's yet other things like gender education and so on. So there's lots of different, ways it is expressed, and some may, be relevant to others.
So let's go back to the first year, and you were talking a lot about your early successes. Were there any hurdles in your first year?
Not specifically, really. I would say that I made a conscious choice not to expand any sort of negative energy. So I know that there were institutions and leaders who felt slightly cynical, possibly even threatened by, JOFA and the use of the word feminism that, scares a lot of people. But, that's not, I'm not there to sort of, chase people up. It's there for those who are interested in. So we don't really push anything in particular. It's about opening up the opportunities for people who want to take them up. And it's also about slowly changing the consciousness and the language. So what's really interesting is that, a partnership minyan, as I said earlier, is seen by many as the most radical innovation that you could do within Orthodoxy. And, a lot of people are uncomfortable with it. But with my own neighborhood in Borum Wood, where I live, a partnership minyan was set up exactly a little bit over a year ago in November 2013. And they were going to start with a Friday night service. And the main shul decided to compete with it, and so organized a women's only Friday night, a Kabbalat Shabbat for women only, women and girls, and they set the date for 2 weeks before the partnership minyan, which was interesting. And I thought that's great,
That's a healthy competition.
That's
wonderful.
A great competition. I mean, because of those radical Orthodox feminists who want a partnership minyan, more women are davening on Friday night, which is great. Not only that, the Federation, which is to the right of the United Synagogue, and, in a sense...
Let me just stop for a minute, because we never really defined United Synagogue. We just talked about Orthodoxy, that United Synagogue is the largest umbrella organization for Orthodox synagogues in the UK, and the Federation is another organization to the right of that.
So the Federation is a smaller sort of umbrella organization for synagogues, they still don't allow women to vote or to be on their boards. Just to give you a flavor, and a bat mitzvah girl will not be able to give a dvar Torah in a federation synagogue, and women cannot speak or teach in a federation synagogue. And it's interesting because, as a knock-on effect, they also, the local one, advertised it was a really colorful flyer where the Rebbitzin was inviting girls with their mothers to come and daven Kabbalat Shabbat with her. So again, I think it's fantastic because everybody, within Judaism is now thinking about, are women davening Friday night? Doesn't matter what level you are, but there's more women davening on Friday night, and that's great for all Jews. It's great for the future of Judaism. It's great, it's not just for women, it's for everyone, it's for the community. And I do remember when I first moved to Bournemouth about 7 years ago, I did think about inviting some people to daven Kabbalat Shabbat with me on a Friday night. And when I asked a few people, they said, oh no, I'm tired on a Friday night. Oh, that's when I go to my friend and we have a cup of tea and we catch up on the week, we like it. There wasn't really much interest, but it seems like the, mood is changing, which is great.
Lovely. Okay, I have a question here from Sarah in Australia. She writes, we feel far from the action and it's hard to bring in big figures and thought leaders. And it's hard for us to see what others are doing. So the community is very conservative. Do you have any thoughts about ways to open people's minds and allow them to think more broadly than is considered normal?
So I would say that, again, my background is in Chabad, and so I've always been very passionate about sort of community service. And I have perhaps the boldness of Chabad shlucha, in a sense. I used to be a shlucha with my husband, and I still at the core feel like I have a shlichut. It might have changed in what it is. But it's very much about sort of like thinking big. And, as I said, you don't really need a huge budget to bring in people, because people travel all the time. And everybody will have some relative somewhere. I have relatives in Australia. I'm sure other people have relatives in Australia. So it's about really trying to use the media to find out who's who and who might be passing by, who might be able to talk about something. Sometimes it's easier to bring somebody from outside your community because it brings people out to hear, and it's a new voice and a fresh perspective, and that sometimes is easier, and sometimes it's about finding people within your own community who might be prepared to speak about it. But it can also be about just small conversations, setting up a Facebook group where you just post things and you start a conversation about things. Or just having, a meeting where you just, get people to pick one issue and see whether that's something that, people are passionate about. That's really, what I was setting out to do. I didn't really think it was going to be as big as it was going to be. And the few people I spoke up to before the launch, they said, yeah, well, it's going to be really rough, be prepared, you're going to get a little flack, not a lot of people are going to be interested, you're going to get... That hasn't been my experience. And I think there was just a thirst there, but nobody was prepared to talk about it in the open. And once the space was opened, everybody wanted to talk about it and got there, and, we can't stop them now. So, yeah, possibly try to be a bit more, just be open to it. See amongst your friends, or perhaps it's not within your friends. Maybe it's people out there who you don't know. Maybe just put out some feelers and see if people want to join you in the conversation, and see where that goes. Try to explore it.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for that comment. And again, we welcome questions from the audience. Okay, so we spoke about the first year. And where is JOFA heading, say, do you think, in the next 5 years? JOFA UK.
So I don't like to predict the future. As I said, when I set up, I get a very different feel. But I can tell you what I'm planning for the coming year. We did a lot of one-off events to begin with, and it was very much about getting people to think about specific topics. What I'm focusing on now is creating year-long courses for specific groups. So I have one particular group of people who I'm really keen to engage are girls just after their bat mitzvah. So pre-bat mitzvah, there's always a lot of excitement. Girls are always preparing for the bat mitzvah. They're studying. There's a number of wonderful programs. and then they have their big day, and then it feels a little bit like a graduation because there's nothing after that, right? There's nowhere to go. And so I call it the 12-year gap. I think it's a minimum of 12-year, conservative, right? From becoming bat mitzvah at 12 until you get married and you set up your own home, and you, if you want to be the akeret abite, there isn't a set path for girls. Boys who become bar mitzvah have a pretty set path. If they want to choose, depending on their background, they can go to minyan every day. They can put on tefillin. They're needed at a minyan. Somebody will invite them to continue laning or daven for the Amud or get involved in youth services. I don't know if they have them everywhere. But there's a lot of opportunities for them to really be engaged, apart from their learning and other things that they do. For girls, it's a little less clear. And so there are opportunities for girls to study more, but that can feel very much like school. There's opportunities for chesed projects sometimes, which is also good and important. But you don't really have that kind of formal way to really make the girls feel needed and also give them a ritual that they can call their own, which I think is really important. And my inspiration for that has been actually the Lubavitcher Rebbe. As I said, I come from a Chabad background. And I think he definitely recognized the importance of giving girls a ritual that was their own. And I don't know how many people remember this, but he set up something that was really radical, a campaign for girls to start lighting Shabbat candles from the age of 3. It was based on the Midrash, but it was not something that was done, regularly. And I think, we need to give girls something that is theirs, that they can do once they turn 12, that, really engages them so that we don't lose them. I know a lot of girls who just after bat mitzvah seem to kind of lose their interest, and they spend all their passion and time and energy discussing other things that are important but perhaps not as important, and it's a shame. I think we need to somehow tap that energy and sort of harness it, and create a space for girls to really be engaged with their Judaism, explore their identity, and study more, and just be passionate and be vibrant. And so we're creating a course for girls, which is based on text study and discussion, but also focused on Megillat Ruth, so that it gives them the opportunity to study the text and explore lots of different issues and values, Jewish values, but also the opportunity to learn a text that they can become theirs. They can learn how to learn Megillat Ruth. They can then find opportunities, whether it's at home on Shavuot to do a women's reading, or within their own shuls. It'll be up to them with their mothers and with their communities, to negotiate where and how they're going to do it, but they can actually, get something that is their project and they can make it their own. So we're starting this year with this. We're also going to create another program for men and women who want to create change in their community, and just to get together, discuss the issues, think about what the approach should be, and just sort of like enable people to, initiate change within their own communities. So some grassroots activism. And we're also going to support them in thinking about how they approach the change. And so we're going to bring in some experts to teach them how to advocate for their communities and how to approach leadership in asking for change. So that's the second program. And then there are a number of other things that we'd like to do, and, stay tuned and you'll hear more.
We will. Okay, so you mentioned that in your original open spaces, you talked about education, gender roles, tefillah. You also said you spoke about the aguna issue. And so that hasn't been mentioned at all in the programs that you've been running in the past 2 years. And I'm curious to know what's going on in the UK in terms of aguna issues and conversion, or any other hot button topics that we've been dealing with here in the US.
So in terms of aguna, there's been a lot of talk about prenups because they're hoping that prenups will become binding within the legal courts. And so once that happens, then there might be an opportunity for the halachic prenup to also be more effective. We currently have a prenup. It's offered to couples. I don't know that a lot of them take it up, but I don't know that it's actually that, enforceable or effective. I don't know how effective a tool it is. So
Does the
that's
United Synagogue try to push rabbis to enforce a prenup in order to be a Masada Kedushin, or is that
so
not a policy?
so the United Synagogue, because it's a centralized system, anybody who wants to get married has to go straight to the chief rabbi's office to get all their documents cleared, and at that point, the rabbi who meets with them centrally there will discuss a prenup with them.
Mhm.
They don't push it very hard because I think they know that it's not all that valuable as a legal tool. So some take it up, some don't. I think the majority of the people do not take it up. And so hopefully, if it could become, you know, legally binding, it would be different. We recently had we co-sponsored a screening of a film called Get, the trial of Vivian Amselin. I don't know if you've seen it. I don't know if anybody in our audience has seen it, but we had done a discussion about Get and Aguna and all of the issues related, which generated a lot of interest. And so we're probably going to do another screening and discussion. And we hope to tackle the issue by having a Aguna Awareness Day this year in March, which will coincide with Tanit Esther, but also with International Women's Day. So it's the same week. And it's about educating women about really what happens when they get married halachically. Because for a lot of women, they have no knowledge of the potential problems they might be getting into it. So just actually to know how a Jewish marriage works from a halachic standpoint and what the Jewish legal implications are. So that's one thing we plan to do. And we'll have to kind of hope that the issue of prenups gets settled in courts. And then we can sort of follow up with that.
Okay. Any other issues? Conversion, mikvah,
So,
that's
so
JOFA UK?
conversions are very strictly handled by the London Beth Din. And personally, as you know, having worked in the community for many years, I know that sometimes the converts are not treated with the most respect. They're given quite a hard time. And, you know, a lot of rabbis have spoken about this, and I think, you know, things could be improved. It is a difficult subject. I don't know how much we can do at this point, but I think the more people talk about it and raise it within their own community and raise awareness, and they can create pressure. Because I think centralized institutions tend to respond to pressure, to communal pressure.
Right.
So
clearly you're creating a lot of conversation in the UK.
that's really, I think it's about
But
a lot of conversation. Yeah, definitely. Mikveh is another really interesting subject because when I moved to the UK 18 years ago, I was like so surprised to find that the United Synagogue has about 50 shuls all over London and the surrounding areas. And they have perhaps one or two mikvahs. I would say one. There's a number of mikvahs, but they don't belong to the United Synagogue. So they build synagogues, they didn't build mikvahs. And I could not believe how many women told me that mikvah is one of those new things that, you know, brides do today, like circling around the groom 7 times. It wasn't required when I got married, they told me. So there's an entire generation of people who just never were told about mikvah, never heard about it. It wasn't spoken about. It was, you know, nothing, you know, that you could breach. And so I was really lucky. When my husband married, officiated weddings, I taught many kalot, most of whom were not observant or, you know, not orthodox in practice, but were really interested. And very often their mothers were interested and came along as well to learn about mikveh. And on occasion, I managed to convince a couple of mothers to go to the mikveh before their daughters' weddings, which is really nice. There's still a bit of an issue in a sense that I think a lot of kalot are being taught by women who belong to the Haredi community, and a lot of the kalot belong to the Orthodox United Synagogue, but are not living an Orthodox lifestyle. And so the conversation and you know, they come from very different perspectives, and so sometimes the language isn't always, you know, one where they can really understand or make sense of it. And I think it would be great to have opportunities for women to learn about mikveh in a different approach. So we're going to start a series of mikveh salons as well. So to just talk about mikveh in a sort of more intimate space, and just invite people to explore it and be open to it. Because mikveh seems for many people a really radical thing that only super frum people do. And I often have told people that, I remember, going to a mikveh in the States and, meeting people who didn't belong to shuls or didn't keep koshers but still went to the mikveh. And in Israel is the same. Mikveh is one of mitzvot that appeals to some people who may not be 100% observant, and that's fine. And so I'm hoping that it might appeal to people, and people find a space to learn about it.
Are there any yoatzat halacha functioning in the UK? Yoatzat halacha are consultants regarding family purity issues.
Yes, so actually we're very lucky that we have our own local yoatzat halacha. Her name is Levine. She is British, and she lived in Israel for a few years with her family and trained as a yoatzat halacha, and came back to the UK, I think about 2 or 3 years, 3 years ago, perhaps, just about that. And interestingly enough, Chief Rabbi Mervis, before he took the position as Chief Rabbi, appointed her on the rabbinic team of his synagogue, which is Kinloss in Finchley. And so she functions as a religious leader in that synagogue, which is a great step, and has really raised the bar and expectation for women in the community, because they're really looking at the chief rabbi after that step for doing quite a lot for women, and that's been fantastic. So it's also raised the conversation about mikveh, because people want to know what is a yoatzat halacha. They never heard the term before, so it's even just an opportunity for people to learn about mikveh and about the fact that there are questions around it. And she has started with her community, a number of women who are actually GPs or interested in women's health in the community, a Yomi Yun type of thing. So they've done the second one just recently, where it's a mikveh and women's health evening, and they had Rabbanit Henkin and many different women within the community, talk about issues around mikveh and women's health. It's been very successful, so it's great.
Okay, so I want to make sure we get to another question from the audience. This is from Adina. How do you balance creating programs for people who want what JOFA has to offer with your work convincing people that there's more for women in Judaism than challah baking?
Okay, don't bash challah baking. I love baking challah, so do enjoy that. But I don't think women should choose between the kitchen and the synagogue, in a sense, or the ritual and the spiritual fulfillment that comes in different ways. And I think women in different times of their lives will find fulfillment in different things. So people tend to often sort of like split it. And so it's like, okay, the women who like to be at home and bake challah, and the women who like to be in shul and, put on a talis or something like that. And I think that's a false dichotomy. I think you can do a bit of both, and you might want, to do some things or neither, really. So how do I balance things? It's not always easy to balance, and I'm not sure I always get the balance right. But creating program, I think, I'm great at generating ideas, and then I try to engage people who are interested in it. So, for example, with the Bat Mitzvah program, I spoke to a few mothers and girls, and they were really excited, and so we just, put it together. We had a first taster session. The girls have come, and then we're going to take their feedback and build a program, a step at a time as we go along based on their feedback. So this is going to be a pilot, and we might get it right sometimes and sometimes not, but, we can go along in that way. And yeah, I mean, I'm lucky in the sense that my family's very supportive, and my kids are a bit more self-sufficient. They can dress themselves now, and even cook for themselves, or for me sometimes. So that's a huge help. And yeah, sometimes I'm up late doing things, and sometimes some things don't get done, but it's not always perfect.
All of us have that problem. So,
Yeah.
okay, so you opened the door a bit before by mentioning Rabbi Mervis, who is the current chief rabbi of UK, and you actually mentioned in some ways how he's supporting the women's roles. What's been his general attitude towards programming for women, education for women, and I guess towards JOFA UK?
So he has definitely been very supportive of women's roles and education. He said he's very passionate about women's education. In his words, it's not just women educating women, but women educating communities. So he seems to be very, positive about that. He has also said in his Rosh Hashanah interview that his priority for the community is women's involvement and small communities. So, he's named 2 items, and women are top of his agenda. He has spoken about wanting to introduce women's prayer groups, so women's tefillah groups. He has specified that those would not include women, reading from a Sefer Torah. So that's something that he doesn't see as part of it. But it's a starting point, and I haven't heard more about how he plans to do it, but it's definitely very encouraging. And I know that many women have told me that they have high hopes for what he's going to do for women. So I think he's still, new in the job in a sense. He's only been there for a year and a bit, so we'll have to give him time to, unroll his plan a bit more. I'm not sure exactly what he thinks of JOFA UK because I haven't asked him directly, but I'm sure somebody can ask him and find out. I know that in general, the response has been very good. I mean, one of the things that you can do to actually very easily and softly change perspective is actually by creating awareness. So one of the things that has been really effective, and it's quite an easy thing to do, and I'm just reminded of the question somebody asked, you don't have a big budget or you can't fly people out. JOFA's Shema B'Kola Divrei Torah are written by women. They're substantial, Dvar Torah. And we introduced them in synagogues and community groups last year. The first one that we introduced was written actually by Gila Sachs, who is a scholar. She also happens to be Rav Sachs, who was the chief rabbi's daughter. And those really were a fantastic way because she wrote a really nice Dvar Torah about Hanukkah. I mean, it's a 4-page booklet. It's not just a light reading, it's something you really, think, and people were really discussing it in shul, and men and women were reading it, and all of a sudden, men are aware that, they can learn Torah, from a woman. That is, normally most of the publications are on people's seats on Shabbat in shul. We'll have a Dvar Torah written by a rabbi or by a man. And all of a sudden you have something that's written by a woman, which is high caliber. And that's a way that, doesn't seem very radical, but can radically shift people's thinking and the way they approach, their perspective. And so little things like that can make a big difference.
So we're going to be wrapping up in a minute, but I just want you to give one piece of advice, maybe 2 at most, to someone who is thinking about starting up women's tefillah, a partnership minyan, a JOFA discussion group, but something in a community that has never seen this kind of thing before. What would be your most important piece of advice for them?
All right. Well, I guess I would say I've got 3 pieces of advice. One is focus on the big picture and stay positive. Don't expand negative energy. So just use your energy to kind of focus on something positive you want to achieve, and don't get tangled into any battles or negative things. Try to engage people in a horizontal way. So try to engage people to do grassroots work rather than, get top down, whether it's you trying to advocate with, the authorities or, negotiating with people, because that gets really complicated. I mean, what's really been fascinating in the UK is that it's such a highly structured organization, a community that has organizations and umbrella organizations. Everything is through umbrella organization. Everything is through very set, old, conservative structures. And all of a sudden you have people realizing that they can do things outside the formal structures. They can take things into their own homes. They can hire a whole get together and do something. And that's been very empowering for people, but also slightly subversive, and shows people that they can, bring Judaism back to their own homes.
Okay, wonderful. So with that, Dina, thank you for sharing your experiences with us, and I wish you good luck with all of your future initiatives for JOFA UK. And I'd like to thank everyone who was in attendance tonight for joining us. If you're interested in listening to recordings of any previous webinars, they're available on JOFA's website, jofa.org/webinars. And one more plug for me, which is if any of you are interested in being involved in JOFA's Women's Tefillah initiatives, we have a project out to catalog ritual practices that are taking place in different women's tefillah groups worldwide. So please be in touch with me afterwards at pam.greenwood@gmail.com. Dina, how can people reach you if they have questions for you after tonight's event?
Okay, so you can look at the JOFA UK webpage, and my email address is that. It's dina.brower@jofa.org.
Okay, thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Good night.